Well, good morning if you are in Long Beach, California. I guess they're watching us there too. Good afternoon if you're in New York City, where I am. Good late afternoon if you
Yeah.
are in Ireland or perhaps in Manchester, England, as they said in the musical Hair. Greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans around the world. Today is May 16th of 2025. And listeners know that my fifth anniversary show was April 25th of this year. I launched it with Susan Graham. And I decided for May, which is my birthday month, to treat myself and I hope my listeners to what I call Fred's favorites. These are people who I adore for their work. Know some of them personally, others not, but people whose work has really inspired me through all kinds of years and issues and ideas and aesthetics. And one of these people, who I know only slightly, we've conversed a couple of times in the lobby of the Metropolitan Opera House, is Phelim McDermott. I'm going to call you a stage director, but there's so much more. I'm going to call you a man of the theater. And you joined me from the UK today. And Phelim, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much. That intro. Nice to be here with you, Fred. I'm remembering. It's fantastic that this show's been going 5 years, but I'm remembering fondly. We met. I think we met in a restaurant on the Strand.
In London.
Yeah. And
Simpsons on the Strand.
yeah, we did one of your meals, and that
Right.
was very memorable. Yeah.
I didn't cook. We had joint of lamb, as I recall,
Yeah.
but this was pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
I used to lead symposia in different cities around the world, and people from around the world would come and join me and travel with me, and we would go to opera. We would eat very well, even in London. The old joke, but one does eat well in
Yeah.
London. Um, and have discussions and meet artists such as yourself. And you did indeed come. And so I didn't plan to start with that, but let's start with that. You did one of the greatest productions of Aida that I had ever seen. And because Aida, we all know Aida if
Yeah.
we know opera. And sometimes one sees opera productions of classic works, masterpieces, where someone who stages it just attempts to do things gimmicky
Mm.
or confuse a bit or thumb their nose in the work of art. What you did and what your work always does for me, the work that I've seen, is you take the work of art as it is on the page, the words and the music, and I don't want to use the word translate. You'll tell me the word you prefer. You bring your vision and that of your collaborators to it. And within the words, without changing a word, in my view, you bring so much meaning to it and you make it incredibly moving for me. And I can
Mm.
say a hallmark of everything of yours that I've seen, mostly opera, but also theater. Um, I leave the theater deeply moved.
Mm.
And that doesn't frankly happen as often as one
Okay.
would like. Um, but you have a perfect record. I've never stepped out of a performance of yours where I wasn't moved, as opposed to, let's say, annoyed. You know,
So there we are. There's a challenge for me, Fred.
I mean, if you want to annoy me, we can work on it. But let's start with that, Aida, because I'd rather you describe it than I describe it, because then I can tell my response. But it was in English. Let's start with that. It was
Yeah.
English
Yeah.
National Opera. It was Latanya Moore and Michelle
Oh,
DeYoung
yeah. Yeah.
as Aida and Amneris. And I'm not going to say anything else. It was powerful to me.
I mean, that's great to hear because it's, in a way, I've done two of the kind of the canon, as it were. And my journey in opera started with working on Philip Glass pieces, and for me, the thing about theatre, the thing about opera, because I consider it my route to opera is definitely like my start is theatre and storytelling. So for me, it's very important when you create a piece that you try and make the stories sing, and you try and make it clear. Now that doesn't mean you can't find exciting slants or perspectives on it, but I've never been interested in that sense of putting something on top of something so much that your voice becomes the director's voice becomes a kind of filter through which you step in the way of the story. Partly because that's what I like when I go to the theatre. I love storytelling. I love being moved, as you say, by theatre. And it goes back to my early days of going to the theatre. It was a place where I guess on a certain level, I got the opportunity to feel emotion, express emotion, maybe in a way that I didn't quite get in my, I don't know, my home life. Or so it's important that when I try and create something, I feel that an audience, of course, gets ideas, but really shifts. And what's memorable and unique about theatre is that it can address things on these different levels. And as you say, a deeper level is something important. And strangely, Aida, it's very interesting what happens when you get. My journey in opera was kind of in later life, and this thing where people review the music separately from the production, I've always found slightly strange. And we got a lot of reviews which in a way I felt like they didn't just review what we'd created. They review, you're seeing it through the filter of their own ideas of what it should be, and so on and so that gets complicated. And my memory of it is that it was a production that wasn't appreciated as much as it could have been, because I think we told the story clearly and we made it very atmospheric, and we tried to be authentic in the sense that we created an authentic ancient Egyptian world that wasn't in a weird way, I'd done Akhenaten, the Philip Glass opera before that, and before we did Aida, me and Tom, the designer, joked about Akhenaten. We must make sure that Akhenaten doesn't look like a bad production of Aida, because we know what that bad production looks like, because it's kind of, I guess it's crass in a way, it's not even archetypal, it's kind of corny. And we made Akhenaten, and then in a kind of weird mirror, we were asked to do Aida, and then we were doing Aida. So we were like, oh, we mustn't make Aida like a corny production of Akhenaten. We tried to create a sense of atmosphere and depth to it, and I think we managed to touch on that. If I have disappointments in that production, is that there's a few ideas that we couldn't push far enough, partly because of the limitations of budget and so on and what you get to do. So I feel like we managed to get a core that was good, but it didn't quite go as far as it could go as a production.
You can disagree with me if you wish, or correct me. I would describe the colors of that production as muted. They were dark. It was not about looking at the scenery. And I've worked on numerous productions of Aida, including Zeffirelli and Verona, the big stuff. I've worked on it in Rome at Caracalla. So I know and love that kind of production.
Yeah.
But with those, you look at everything surrounding the singers.
Yes.
And the fact that in this particular case, there was not there were tangible items when you
Yes,
needed them
yeah,
for props, thrones and such, but they were not about the color. So therefore, I looked at the singers.
yes,
I looked at it more as a drama than any other production of Aida I've ever seen or worked on. And if you want me to not give it away, I won't, but I'm going to give it away. The triumphal scene of the second act,
yeah,
I was in tears, and I'm getting goosebumps as I say that. And believe me, I've never been in tears in the triumphal scene in Aida.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
reason is these were people coming home from war.
yes, yeah,
They were not bringing pelf and things they conquered and
mm,
so
mm,
on, the way the former Met production, not the current one, did,
yeah, yeah,
where they would, bring everything out of Ethiopia that they could grab.
yeah,
In this case, they were bringing home the dead.
yeah. I mean, that's right. We decided, well, first of all, I think my work is very influenced by the work of Michael Chekhov.
Mm-hmm.
And his work, one of the big elements of Chekhov's work is atmosphere and getting performers to inhabit an atmosphere and feel the space between each other on stage as a tangible thing, which the audience can pick up on and then contribute to. So I think that's right, because if you're going to go down spectacle, it's kind of, the Met's been there, and that's not what we were aiming for. We were aiming more for atmosphere, and as you say, the emotion that's in the air between the performers and so on. So it's great that you picked up on that. And then, as you say, we wanted to make that a real story of what war was about. And as you say, the dead being brought back, and it had, it had echoes of the folding of the flags of soldiers that happens in that military style in the USA, and honoring the dead and honoring the dead and making that real, and then turning that into a thing that then becomes a kind of spectacle with those bodies present,
Yeah.
and the kind of ambiguity of that. And it we also were trying to rhyme. I mean, what year was that?
2017.
Yeah, it was the beginning of stuff with what was happening in the USA, and and our current political ongoing current political situation of powerful people and the trappings of all that, how soldiers are treated, how power is treated, and then within that context, that very human, intimate love story, tragic love story. So I think we tried to touch on each of those elements in a kind of big, clear way. My, it, we had a big fantasy which we didn't get to do in our that triumphal march, was that, in a and this is the production. If ever we get to do it again, maybe we'll get to do this. In the Edinburgh Tattoo, where they do this crazy thing where they,
Blaine, I know what that is, but not everybody knows what
yeah,
the Edinburgh tattoo is.
well, it's
It's
like
not flat on your
yeah,
skin.
it's like a very ritualistic military demonstration.
Yeah.
And what the soldiers do in that Edinburgh Tattoo is they deconstruct a massive cannon, and they carry it across a sort of pretend river, and then they build it together, and it's like a demonstration, a very strange old-fashioned demonstration of teamwork and troops working to do something. And it's kind of it's sort of brilliant and slightly weird, because it's sort of this strange ritualistic macho thing. So at the end of that thing with the soldiers being brought in, we then wanted to do a thing where we saw the building of a ridiculous, massive cannon, like that old film, The Cannon.
Yes.
Yeah, like that. and then
Okay.
it would at the end of it would fire out into the audience, but there wasn't the budget. So
That's okay.
you can imagine that, because it also, that would be our kind of military. It was like military display, and I think even now there's talk of military displays happening in America and so on. This thing that happens in these big political things, which is so macho and sort of disturbing, but have a power to them, So
I always think that those are political theater for people who don't know theater.
yes, I think that's right. Yes, yeah.
And what was moving about the production of Aida that we're talking about is that it was entirely theater.
Oh,
And one of the consequences of the way the story was told was that Amneris, in other words, the princess of Egypt who wants to marry the hero Radames, but he's in love with Aida, the Egyptian princess who's been enslaved, is that Amneris has to decide about her country and her leadership role. And she's faced with something very sobering. Normally, the Amnerises that I've seen don't face. They see spectacle and glory. We're going to marry this guy and that will be happily ever after. Not only does she, quote, have the disappointment of not getting Radames, but she faces real issues about running her country.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was all without your adding any dialogue to the story. It was there in the production.
Yeah. Oh,
and the way Michael DeYoung played it, so very subtly, very beautifully, but without underlining. And that he was, number one, the power of that production, but number two, your work in general, is that when I come away from it, I don't feel I'm being lectured to. I feel like being invited into ideas, and whatever I'm bringing at that moment is the way I engage with it. So I can see one of your productions more than once, which I tried to do, and not revisit what I knew, but come as if I'd not seen it before. Now, I didn't think we'd talk about Aida first, and I didn't think we'd talk about Così fan tutte second.
No,
but because there were all kinds of other things I would talk about. But you directed a wonderful production at the Met. I think some people found it controversial. I did not, of Mozart's Così fan tutte. And the reason I'm bringing this up is a number of years ago, I was invited to teach at West Point, which is north of New York City. It's the academy for elite, wonderful, brilliant, patriotic men and women cadets who are not simply trained in the art of war, but the philosophy of ideas and how war can maybe be avoided rather than engaged in. And part of the curriculum there was to have opera. And it happened that the Metropolitan Opera on succeeding days was doing Aida and Così fan tutte. So I taught them Aida and Così ahead of time.
Wow. Yeah.
And then we had discussions after the operas. And I sort of thought that Aida would be the challenging one for them, and that Così would be sort of, a charming delight and so on. I was entirely wrong.
Oh.
Aida made sense to them because of do you put country over private life? The decisions there were very clear. They had been down that road.
Yeah.
Whereas in Così fan tutte, ostensibly a comedy about relations between men and women, to them was about two women who were horrified at the prospect that their boyfriends were going off to war.
Yeah.
And how did they respond when the boys were away? I'm saying boys and girls in this case.
Yeah.
When the boys were away, one of the women wanted to remain steadfast to the boy she loved. The other woman was a bit variable about maybe, well, he's away, let's try something else.
Yeah.
And the cadets, men and women, found it rather objectionable, number one, that they would treat this so lightly, but number two, that I apparently had not acknowledged the seriousness of what it means to go off to war and how it breaks up the family.
Okay.
And so ever since that, I see Così fan tutte not only as everything we know it to be, but an opera about war.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that the Met program that Aida and Cosi together,
Oh.
I don't think they knew that consequence, and I didn't think of it. But I was taught, and this is why I love opera, because people teach me all the time, even though I teach opera. And I will never again think of Così fan tutte in the same way. So that said, had that ever dawned on you as an issue in the opera in Così?
You know, my memory of working on it was there's the whole thing centers on the crazy idea of these disguises. You know, they pretend to go away to war, and then they come back disguised, and the often the criticism I heard was it's so ridiculous, no one would believe it. So how do you? So our challenge was, how do you create a frame for that story where it's believable? And for me, I feel like we wanted to create a world that was a little bit like the lovers in Midsummer Night's Dream,
Mm-hmm.
where they go into the forest, and because they go into this magical world, you believe the craziness of the mixed up love stories and so on. So Tom, the designer, and it's interesting because I said I don't like ideas that are put on top of things. Tom said, I've always wanted to do, and he'd done Così a number of times before. He said, I've always wanted to do it set in Coney Island. And I said, oh, really? And then as I began to think of it, I thought, no, that is a really great idea, because it is like a place that people go to, and it's slightly kind of sexy stroke seedy. People are it is, you know, the seaside where it's people slightly think about being other than what they usually are. So
Mm-hmm.
it felt like our version of the Midsummer Night's Dream forest, that you would go to Coney Island and you would get like intoxicated by these wonderful this community of wonderful kind of sideshow performers, and as they called them themselves, who were in the show, the kind of freaks, as it were.
Yeah.
And that would bring out these kind of marginalized sides of these people in a way where they would behave in ways that were not so polite. So that was very much the frame of that. So I guess in our production, you're right, we didn't take the idea of war quite so seriously, because in a way our male lovers weren't taking it so seriously. They were
Right.
using it as a ploy, you know. So but I can understand that they might see that that's kind of insulting to people who, you know, do go to war, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
And the fact that the West Pointers said to me how lightly it was taken,
Yeah,
when in fact this is something where people can lose their lives. And,
yeah,
I wish in a way that we could have these West Pointers, who are most of them very brilliant and
yeah,
very caring, see your productions of Così fan tutte and Aida,
yeah.
and
That's
then have this
interesting. That's
discussion.
great. Yes. Yeah, they should have that conversation with Mozart, I think.
Yeah.
You
And
know.
the Ponte. But another thing about Così fan tutte, I mean, I find it an endlessly fascinating, if troubled, opera.
Yeah, yeah.
Because when I teach it, I don't teach it in the traditional way. I often teach it with Richard Strauss's Electra,
Oh,
because
okay.
it's about psychology and about
Mm,
rawness of feelings that are sometimes covered up with other things.
yes, yes, that's right.
And what I see in the opera Così fan tutte is people creating personae.
Yes, that's
And
right.
in our world where people can have online aliases,
Yeah,
and where they go to cocktail parties and they speak differently,
yes,
where there are so many opportunities to not be ourselves, or
yes,
to
yeah,
step away from who we understand ourselves to be and become someone or something else, that we no longer know who we're dealing with. I feel we're often dealing with someone's creative persona and
yeah.
not the real person.
Yes, and I think for me, in our version of that story, what we were saying was that the whole journey where it all goes, and then they get back together, and you go, oh, is it gonna? For me, that's about if they hadn't had that story and they just got married, those elements, those what the sort of Jungian sub personalities that are present in all those characters, they would have to deal with that in their later marriage at some point.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like having gone through that story. Now they're probably marrying the person that they know more about that person.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's like possible that their marriage will be a bit healthier because they won't be rose tinted about what that relationship is, you know. So I do think it is playful, but it's also very sophisticated in its understanding of what people and love is really like, I think.
I recently had the mezzo soprano Isabel Leonard at my NYU class that people can watch online. They go to YouTube and enter Adventures in Italian Opera. Fred Plotkin, Isabel Leonard, from April 22nd of 2025. And we got into a long discussion about Così fan tutte because Isabel Leonard is a very beautiful, very confident, able person who is a wonderful singer, but she also is self-reliant and spoke about the fact that, as she's a single mother and she runs her career and she's disciplined and all of the things that Dorabella is not, and that she's kind of had it with Dorabella and probably would not want to sing her again.
Yeah.
Although I want her to do it with Federico Lombardi because I think it'd be perfect casting. But I understood what she meant by that.
Yeah.
And I feel that Dorabella sometimes gets a raw deal, except that Dorabella is the funny one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's the one who's most innately connected to her sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than any of the others, the boys or her sister Fiordalici, or the philosopher Don Alfonso, or and I don't mean this in a negative way, a different class, Despina, the maid, who is not of the class of these two young ladies. And I only mean in terms of economics. But everyone else is applying the wisdom, their opinions, their feelings. Dorabella, and I wish I'd said this to Isabel Leonard, I didn't think of it, is in touch with her sexuality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And now that I'm thinking about that, I want to call up Isabel Leonard and say, this is how you can play her.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
she makes her choices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the others seem more floating and vague and insecure. You can even hear it in their music.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why a work like Così fan tutte, which is very easy to knock, despite the absolutely glorious music, I think can be eternally mined for the MINED, for the way it explores who we are, not only in the words, but especially in the music.
Yeah.
Because the indecision or the fear is depicted in Mozart's music more than the words.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because, I don't really know how to talk about pieces that I'm working on really until after I've done them. So after I've done them, I can pretend that I knew what I was doing, and what I find out what things are about by being in that process and discovering with a company. And so afterwards I go, oh yeah, that and that, I can feel that. And I don't know if I taught you about this, but we did this. I'd been playing with this thing called instant acting, or the Whelan recording technique. I don't know if I've taught you about this before, Fred.
Nope.
So, well, there's an extraordinary American actor no longer with us called Jeremy Whelan, and he wrote a book called Instant Acting. And I picked it off the shelf many years ago, partly because I thought it was in the UK. I thought people in England won't take this seriously. I was immediately drawn to it. instant acting. It sounds like cheating, like Erzart's instant coffee. And basically, he came up with an actor's process for how to work on script and text without holding a book in your hand, So rehearsing, people sit, they rehearse, and then there's a point where people have got to know their lines and whatever. But then for quite a long time, you see the shadow of the text, So I began playing with this because what it involves is that you record the text very accurately, very slowly, without doing any acting. So you read the text neutrally and almost like surprisingly slowly. And say you're working on a scene, you record it very slowly. And then the performers get into the space and they play back the text. So they hear their own lines, but it means that they're free to improvise and to interact and move in the space straight away. So any impulse they get to try something with a prop or to move towards the other performer or to embrace them or to interact happens much earlier in the process. Then you go back and you record it again. And they record it again, still slowly, and saying, don't do any overacting in your recording or in your vocal play. Just take your time. Then they get up in the space and you say, now do the scene again. Don't do anything you did the first time. So they're sort of banned from repeating that really good bit of business they found or that moment. And you keep doing that. And you go through a process where they get to know the text inside out. And by the end of it, having played it lots of different ways, after 5 times you say, now just play the scene. And they say, but I've not sat down and learned my line. Trust that you've learned it. Trust that your body knows it and see what happens. And they remember at least, 85% without prompting of the text. And it is like the words are popping out of them. It's like they're improvising text for the first time. And I've done this with Shakespeare, so that's kind of extraordinary. And I got braver about doing it with opera singers. Now, one thing opera singers often don't like to do is hear their own voice. And I have to persuade them that that's an interesting thing. And opera singers also, they have to know their music before they arrive. So, but we did that technique on Così fan tutte. And what that meant was that there was we had these 3 rooms that people, like a motel, like a kind of David Lynch motel. So the scene, they were coming in and out of, and they improvised really quickly all sorts of comedy business in a way, in quite a short rehearsal period, that was really, really exciting because they were amazing performers who, they would try something, but everybody's improvising together. So we got a very sophisticated, farce-like production where lots of things were happening. And it really was created by the performers themselves, which was exciting. Mm-hmm. So in terms of looking at that, it was not like me saying, oh, try this bit of business, try this bit of business. They had the playground, and the performers of the original production did that. And then we had our ensemble of what we called our Coney Island Skills Ensemble. And they were jugglers, contortionists. There was a woman with a snake, and they were like
very much so
of they were like Don Alfonso's fairies, like in Midsummer, what's his name in Midsummer Night's Dream? Oberon's fairies. Oberon. Yeah. So they were also included in that very easily. And often, if you have actors or even chorus, they can be very separate. So the whole thing felt very much integrated. And then we had this challenge where Tom said, let's have a different fairground ride for each different aria. So the ensemble made that world in which so it was very dreamlike and very, I think, very romantic and kind of heady and beautiful, you know. I was
I
very,
felt that the people who were the skill set, those special characters,
yeah,
had taken the subway from Brooklyn.
yeah,
They had that
absolutely.
feeling about them
But
that they
some
were
of them
not,
had,
yes, they really felt like
absolutely,
these were the people one could see in Coney Island, on a Friday
absolutely,
night when it's
yeah,
very hot and there's no air conditioning and the
exactly,
ocean smells. It was that kind of thing.
yeah. You know, and it was talk about being touched by, moved by something. Very often, these performers would come in and they were, you know, famous for sticking things, you know, blades through bits
Yeah.
of their flesh and all this sort of, you know, the kind of crazy stuff, the strong man. And you know, and I would talk about the that they would become an ensemble in this production of Così fan tutte, and so many of them, it was their dream. They loved the opera. It was their dream to be on that stage, and they never imagined that they might end up there. So there was something within their presence of that group of people being on the stage of the Met that was also very powerful in a way. And I was like surprised how many of them were real opera
Yeah.
fans. So in the rehearsal room, their commitment to the piece was total, because they were, you know, they were next to these amazing, beautiful singers that they were in the same show. So it was fantastic, really, very potent atmosphere.
I tend not to create definitions that are really limitations. If I say that so and so is an actor and so is an opera
Yeah.
singer,
Yes.
but you had in your cast in Così fan tutte and later in the hours, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about, um, a performer named Kelly O'Hara.
Yeah.
Kelly O'Hara is, even though she's, I guess, in her 40s, already theater royalty in
Yeah.
New York City, has done so many musicals, and she's a wonderful actress and can play comedy. And recently did played the role of an alcoholic in a musical that was sort of a downer, except that she was so beautiful and
Yeah.
believable, and was beautiful Kelly O'Hara that you
Yeah.
could accept the difficulty of the character. The It was Days of Wine and Roses, based on the film
Yeah. Yeah.
played by Lee Remick. What struck me in Così fan tutte, which I think was her Met debut, I'm not certain,
Yeah.
um, that she had come from, quote, the theater world
Mm.
into the opera world, and but her training was in opera in
Yeah.
Oklahoma as a singer, and does it very, very well indeed. And I never felt we were being compromised because she was a Broadway performer, so to
Yeah.
speak. But I also felt, and I've never met her, so I haven't asked her this, um, that she got more into your method or understood your method better than anyone else did.
You know, she's a wonderful total theater animal, you know. So, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying, she was nervous because, as you say, her training was in opera, and then she found that world uh, quite unfriendly and unsupportive to her, so ended up going into Broadway and theater. So this was like a bit like my love affair with opera being a late blooming. She had a similar thing of, she was coming into this world that she'd found difficult to begin with, I think. So she was nervous around that. So actually, the way in for her through that playful way, I think put everybody in the same space, because it does put people, I guess, you know, it's not stand here, sing that, do this. It really is, let's create this together. And it can be challenging, because it puts people in a vulnerable place, which I actually think is the best place to be for performance, because you're at an edge, you're at this place of exploration, discovery. But if people commit to that, everybody is in the same world, and I too get intimidated by the world of opera. I'm not classically trained. I am a very musical animal. I know that. I know that my theatre that I've made over the years has always had a musical sensibility to it, but it's very intimidating to know that there are some people who know the intellectual ideas of this bit of music, and I don't know that. So I think where I do connect to opera is it's theatre, and when it's best, it's total theatre. And my big discovery for opera was this thing where I realized it had the ability to create a sort of theatrical discussion, whatever that means, on deeper levels that often you don't get in theatre. Sometimes you get very intellectual things in theatre, but for me, there are these deeper levels to what theatre can be, and opera absolutely opens that up as a possibility to kind of reach people on ideas level and intellectual level, and that can be musically stimulating, but actually these deeper things, which I think make theatre, make opera all the more important now, as you know, because it's a live experience of these things. So that I don't quite know how my discussion got here, but I think I try and create a space where people step into that world, and if they do, the idea that I'm a theatre performer, or as you say, one doesn't want to classify people in that way. What one wants to classify people as is people who want to create great theatrical experiences. And when opera is its most extraordinary, what could be more theatrical than the totality of an orchestra underlining those emotional themes, underlining the wideness and the scope of what those stories can be, in a way that sometimes you get in theatre, but not always, I think.
So I'm not going to name names because I don't want to, but there are very famous theater directors who I think do splendid work in the theater and even in musical theater. And I say even because then you have the elements of music as well as spoken dialogue, who just miss what opera is about. And I find that they do that because they've studied so hard that they bring their scholarship to the production, emotions when they do an opera production. And I've heard some of these very famous directors speak, and they can go on and on about what Verdi intended or what the history of Italy was in 15 whatever or 18 whatever. And then but it's dry because they don't seem to grab that it's the music telling the story. As people who come from the theater, and I was trained first in the theater, want it to be the words. It's not. It's the music, and I learned that a long time ago. And I think once I learned that and accept that the storyteller is also the composer, is inspired by the lyrics, by the words, and in the case of people like Wagner and Berlioz, wrote the words. But nonetheless, it's a combination of both. Richard Strauss famously, repetitively said, "Prima la musica, poi le parole." First the music, then the words.
Yes.
And yes, that's correct. I believe. I think he's right. And Verdi understood what words can do, but it was really his music. So that in Aida, in the famous procession scene, triumphal scene, it's the music that moves you.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
that's right. And I know when I'm working on something, I know, and I have an intuition or an idea of what should happen at a certain moment. I felt it in my body first.
Mm-hmm.
So the music's spoken to me, and I can feel a shift happen in my body, and I don't know why sometimes, but I know what should happen here, or I know that was right. And I've noticed it in moments where, certainly working on the glass at things, I've had these moments where, and I don't quite know how to intellectualize this, but there's been a moment in a scene where someone does a gesture, and and then they do it on the shift in the music. So they time it so that as that change happens, the gesture happens.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly with Glass's language, what I discovered was if the gesture happened before the shift in the music, so the gesture happened and then the shift in the music happened, something psychological was communicated to me, which I feel in my body. And I think that's sometimes the difference between musical theatre and what I feel is one of the ways in for me with opera. Because very often with musical theatre, there will be people working on counts, and that dance has to happen, and the whole thing has to happen on a button. And
Mm-hmm.
with opera, the language is that, but if you want psychology and depth in there, you have to make sure that those two things are working together to make psychological and emotional shifts happen for the audience. So they're not being told what to think. They are experiencing that shift themselves first. Now, I don't know how to articulate that properly, but I do know when I see it, I will say to a singer, make sure you do that gesture before that shift in the music happens, because that's really powerful and I can feel something happen. And I saw that very clearly with Glass, and I feel that's probably in lots of musical operas, those moments where the music's working with the picture and the image in that way.
There are some characters in opera. I could name many, but I'm just going to name two: Mozart's Donna Anna and Don Giovanni,
Mm-hmm.
Verdi's Rigoletto, where, in my opinion at least, the music the composers made for those characters is their thought process.
Yes.
And therefore, when we hear the music, we're inside the head of Anna, or we're inside the head of Rigoletto.
Yes.
And the composer is giving us those gestures, those reactions. There's particularly in Donna Anna, there's a moment when she realizes that the man, Don Giovanni, that she has been drawn to in different ways, is the killer of her father. And it's just a few notes. And most women who play Donna Anna do not sort of do the stock gesture, but it has to be reflected in their body and on their face. And it's one of the great moments in opera that you can't direct. The performer has to live it and experience it.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying about how musical theater performers have to hit their mark in age, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I would push back a little and say opera is confining because the number of measures or bars that the composer wrote for a singer means that she has to fulfill that music and whatever gesture or action in a designated time frame. Whereas in certainly spoken theater, but also musical theater, you have more flexibility.
Interesting. Yeah.
And therefore, opera singers are constrained by, I don't want to say a negative way, by the fact that their service is first to the music.
Yes.
And then to the theater. And therefore, they have to do what the music asks.
Mm-hmm.
Within
Mm-hmm.
that context, create the theatrical elements.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you were mentioning Philip Glass, and I was going to get to him.
Mm.
Um, you, I did not see. I think it's called The Perfect America, which is about
Yeah.
Walt Disney that you directed
Yeah.
and writ. Um, and I've never even heard a note of it, so I know nothing about that or the production. But your productions of Satyagraha and Akhenaten, I think many people adore Akhenaten's production, and I certainly do.
Mm.
I must say, I was more moved by Satyagraha.
Mm. Mm.
Akhenaten is magisterial. It is in a way like Aida,
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas Satyagraha was about the emotional turmoil of a
Mm.
man, Gandhi,
Mm.
and the world that surrounded him, the pressures that he faced, and how he grew and evolved as a result of that, as told in music,
Mm.
a lot of it in languages that we don't
Yeah.
understand. I
Yeah.
had no connection to it. Um, and I'll say this to you, Phelim. I don't know if I ever said it to you before. I caught a lot of hell for an article I wrote about your production of Satyagraha. I don't review, and I
Mm.
probably wrote, I haven't read it in years, but I probably wrote something like, I don't review, but if I were to review, this
Okay.
is what I might say. And what I loved about it, I think 2011, was it was at a time of financial crisis, even
Mm.
more than
Mm.
now, believe it or not, and that opera companies were struggling to pay the bills, and they were looking for ways of doing valid opera theatrical productions of operas
Mm.
in ways that were not about throwing money on the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I felt that your Satyagraha was at that point the finest production I'd ever seen of an opera where it was not about the money,
Mm. Mm.
about the ideas that conveyed what the composer and
Mm.
librettist were after, plus the story itself.
Mm.
And the article I wrote concluded by saying I would love to see Phelim McDermott stage Wagner's Ring Cycle.
Oh.
And the reason I caught hell for that
Mm.
was that it was taken as a criticism of existing productions when it was not in any way
Mm.
at all. I was not even thinking of other productions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I love The Ring. I teach it
Yeah.
all the time. That given what I just seen you do with Satyagraha,
Mm.
that I would love to see how you can approach the lizards and the dragons and the
Yeah.
frogs
Yeah. Yes.
and the Norns and the giants and all of that in a way that perhaps uses puppetry, perhaps uses different kinds of gesture,
Mm.
uses lighting in different ways. And I, as someone with a background in theater production, was very inspired by the idea of seeing you take on the ring. And I really caught hell for it from a lot of
Oh.
people, not
Oh.
because of you,
Yeah.
but because it was perceived that I didn't like any other ring cycle production, which is completely wrong.
Oh.
But I paid for it. Let's
Oh,
put it
yeah. This is the world of opera that and that's definitely the territory that I'd been warned about. You know, if you're gonna if you're going to get some trouble, you'll get them from the Wagnerian brigade.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it wasn't just the Wagnerian, it
I
was the
know.
people who felt that they had the ultimate vision of it. And the thing about Wagner in general, but the Ring Cycle in particular, there is no ultimate vision.
No, no,
And that's why I want to see new productions. And
exactly. That's why it's still being done,
yeah,
presumably, like Shakespeare.
yeah,
I mean, weirdly, I know that Phillips talked about this. He he says if my operas are going to be continued to be done, I have to accept that there will be some amazing productions and there will be some terrible productions. I'm not going to tell people what to do. So it's like he has a long arc vision of hopefully his operas being done again in the future. And I think that's right. If the original work, it can stand up to all sorts of different ways. And some of those ways one is going to like, and some of those ways one is not going to like. So, that's the journey. The idea that there is a definitive production, I don't think is. I mean, there may be one's own personal definitive things where you go, I was this age and I saw this production of Cyrano de Bergerac with, you know, at this time. It's a personal thing, you know. But you know, these works are great, and we're lucky to have them, and they will continue to be done again and again, hopefully.
Because because Akhenaten is very much out there in the world in productions and Anthony Ross Costanzo and videos and so on, and people can have more access to it. If there's anything you want to say about it, say it. But then I want to go to Satyagraha.
You know, I think definitely for me, I'd done Satyagraha, I'd done The Perfect American, and then I was asked. It was actually John Berry at the E&O. He said, "Do you want to do Akhenaten?" And I thought, "Oh, am I the person? Am I the person who only ever does Philip Glass?" You know, I love Philip Glass, but I said, I'm not sure. Maybe you should. And then I had the conversation with Tom Pye, and he said, "Oh no, Akhenaten's amazing. The music is, and it's so different." And in a way, there was a kind of sense of wanting to do something very different with Akhenaten. And then there was the promise of, you know, there's a sense that the portrait trilogy, as Philip calls it. And I don't know if you know this story, but originally, this will lead us back to Satyagraha. Originally, I was approached by the E&O, and it was actually Sean Doran at the time. He was there briefly. He said, "Do you want to do Einstein on the Beach?" And I said, "What? There's no way, you know, this is, you know, nearly this 20 years ago. No way I would think of doing Einstein." It at that point was like, it's like a fever dream from Philip Glass and Robert Wilson's mind, you know. It's like telling someone to. So I had this meeting with Philip in the East Village, and he said, "What do you want to do Einstein on the Beach for?" And I said, "I don't." He said, "Oh." We talked for an hour, and at the end of that meeting, and he said, "Your genuine reluctance to do this piece makes me think you should do it." And I said, "Yeah, maybe, but is there something else?" And he suggested Satyagraha. He said, "There's this opera that's been forgotten about."
Yeah.
And I think it's a great opera. And I went away and I looked and listened and went, "Oh no, this is so timely. It's so timely." So that's how the work on Satyagraha happened. And now I've done Akhenaten. And I don't know if you know this, but it's been announced that we're going to be doing Einstein on the Beach. So so that's going to happen in 2 years' time in Manchester. And I feel like it's quantum physics, you see. It's kind of time. I've worked my way backwards to that moment where Philip said, "I think you should do it." And so now we are going to do Einstein. And there will be a point somewhere in the future where I will have done all three of the portrait trilogy.
And here I was about to pitch you a different Philip Glass opera, and I'll do that in a minute. But the one I think is the most forgotten masterpiece.
Oh,
but
yeah, okay.
I will.
I've got my pen ready. Yeah,
we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But the thing about Satyagraha, the production, I mean, I love the opera, I love the story. I was so taken by, in Italian cookery, when we talk about cucina povera, the poor cooking, the poor materials, doesn't mean it's bad. It means you're using the most basic elements to produce food for survival.
Yeah.
And I felt in looking at that production that you took the most basic, tangible things, the way people in poverty, South Africa, India, under the British colonial era, that even though Gandhi was a huge intellect and courageous and everything, he was surrounded by poverty in every sense.
Yeah.
And that what we had was not a depiction of poverty, but the paucity of materials. And but again, as I said about Aida, you didn't underline it at all. It was just there.
I mean,
I don't know if other people noticed it, but that's why I felt you could do an economical ring and make it very meaningful because you don't have to create a real giant or a real dragon.
I mean, I think so. I think, you know, it's in all our work really, in the sense that it always has to be human, and I think theatre is about humanity, and you know the kind of, you know, Brooke talks about poor theatre, and
Peter Brook.
yeah, the idea that transformation can happen from a simple material seemed the right thing to do, not least because opera is this grand, you know, rich form, but you have an opera that's theme is simple people and creating change through collective connection. And I've talked about this, but it's about Gandhi, but it's not really about Gandhi. Satyagraha is an opera about a concept. You know, it's about this new word that Gandhi created, which meant truth force or love force, collective change powerfully through a commitment both to you know, the need for political change, activism in the world, but actually the commitment to work on oneself in order to make that change happen. So the idea of doing that with a grand, big visual didn't tell the right story. So the story of making big, powerful images through newspaper, which was one of the themes in the opera, and baskets. We used baskets. We saw this idea of Gandhi and weaving and simple materials. And then the kind of slightly random thing of sticky tape in the third act.
Yeah.
Which, you know, again, a simple material which used to construct things and lit in a certain way is transformed into something more ethereal and spiritual. So that seemed to be a great vocabulary for that opera. So yeah, you know, I think that again, I can talk very intellectually about that retrospectively, but at the time it was like, what are we going to do?
But that was actually my question: is how did you arrive at that? Because to me, it was the perfect expression of everything you just spoke of, but it also, I didn't walk into the theater expecting it.
Yes.
I didn't find myself obviously objecting to it. I found myself entirely embracing and being moved by it. But I spoke to many people who were confused. Whereas to me, it was very eloquent.
You know, in a way, there'd been work that we'd been doing in our smaller scale shows, and also in plays where we would use puppetry and the vocabulary of puppetry to create images. And very often there'd be a small window where you could do that. And with Satyagraha, there was acres of landscape of like, what happens in this scene? Because it doesn't say what they build an ashram. That's it. What's going to happen? You know, there were very few linear narrative plot points. So in a way, the visual images that we created with the simple animation of puppetry materials seems to make sense to make a kind of visual narrative in that work, which, you know, Philip's operas don't work on the same level, in that same linear, one person speaks and another person replies. They aren't like that. They're much more like meditations.
Yeah.
And in a way, the puppetry itself is a kind of trance-like meditation process. So it was just an opportunity to use that vocabulary and then to dare ourselves to see how far we could go with it. So we made these designers, and there's going to be two enormous, archetypal puppet warriors that fill the whole space. And I remember Peter Relton, who was in the chorus, but also has assisted me many times since there was people the chorus looking and saying, well, that's not going to happen. And we made those images happen, and although it's simple, there's a lot of kind of ridiculous courage in saying we have to fill a big operatic space.
Yeah.
Which again, it rhymes with the courage of the idea that, these protests were going to be just people protesting against big, powerful oppositional forces. So
Yeah.
it made a kind of sense, I think.
So the opera I was going to pitch to you, the Met in 1992 commissioned from Philip Glass a work called The Voyage.
Yes.
And it featured Stephen Hawking and Christopher Columbus,
yes,
and Queen Isabella of Spain, and others. And I adored it.
Oh,
and
wow.
It had a good production.
Yeah.
I remember certain things from the production. It's 1992, so it's 33 years ago, and I've seen the opera, but I do remember things from it. But I think it would speak to us very differently, but more deeply now, even than it did then.
Yeah.
It's saddled by the fact that one of the characters is Christopher Columbus,
Yes.
who was reviled in certain sectors.
Yes.
I don't revile him nearly as much as a lot of people do, because yes, he was part of the Spanish Empire, and they brought disease and killing, and wouldn't defend that. But he also, I believe, was the most influential person in history in terms of agriculture, in terms of food economics, in terms of what's called the Columbian exchange of ideas and materials, and brought things to Europe and from, quote, the New World, from the Americas, brought products from Africa to the Americas, so that bananas and coffee, which grow well in South America, actually came from Africa.
Yeah.
And peppers and things came from South America to Europe. Tomatoes, chocolate are American. Vanilla is American. There are all these things. And it was Columbus, and we could read his diaries, who did that in his 4 voyages in the Columbian Exchange, and wrote about the way people ate. And did he intend to be this person? No. Is he remembered for that? Unfortunately, no. Queen Isabella was the one who, through religion and she wanted gold, sent him off that way. Stephen Hawking, I don't want to explain the role he has in this opera, but it was fascinating that you can have Stephen Hawking in his wheelchair using mechanical devices to express himself, being focused on time, the way that Isabella and Columbus in their own ways were focused on time and distance and journey, and it's called The Voyage. And it's about a lot more than people traveling.
Okay.
It's about this kind of voyage. And I loved it. And I think it's just been forgotten. I think it's ready for its close-up again. And you can tell Philip Glass I said so.
I will do. Yeah. I've got to get Einstein out of the way first. I've got to do quantum physics first.
Do that. And you probably will connect with Stephen Hawking while you're doing that.
Exactly.
You, several times in our conversation, have used the word we, and I know it's not the royal we. Talk about we have done this and we work on that, and this is what we have discussed. It's because you are part of have you used the term company, collective, movement that is called Improbable?
Yeah.
And that's the we. Would you talk about what Improbable is and how it was born?
Improbable was a kind of company that was born out of people who were already working together. And we'd actually done a show at the Nottingham Playhouse Theatre many years ago. And it was a show called Improbable Tales. And Improbable Tales was an improvised play. What was radical about it at the time was it had a big set. So it was different every night. But it had a set that was like a fairy tale set with lots of different drops, like an old traditional Pollock's toy theatre, you know, with there was a cave and there was a palace, and it was like a little, like when you're a child and you had your toy theatre that you played with, you know. And each night we would do a different show. In the wings, the stage crew were also improvising, and they would fly in the scenery without telling us what it was going to be, and so everyone was improvising on that. And that show, Improbable Tales, happened, and then we'd done a lot of shows. This is me and Lee Simpson, who's one of the Comedy Store players, and a very experienced improviser and director himself, and Julian Crouch, who designed Satyagraha, had designed Improbable Tales, and then our producer Nick Sweeting. And we had decided that we wanted to make a smaller scale show and do something more personal, more in the kind of Robert Lepage kind of style of storytelling and devising and so on. And we went to the Arts Council and they said, well, maybe we'll give you some money, but you have to have a name for your company. And we were like, oh, what are we going to call it? And we went, oh, we're just an Improbable Tales. Let's call our company Improbable. And it's got the Brits version of improv is impro. So my teacher was a man called Keith Johnston, and he wrote quite a famous book in the improvisation world called Impro, which is a brilliant book about creativity and improvisation, which I recommend everyone goes and reads. If you want to know where my sensibility of where creativity and how you work together, then read the book Impro by Keith Johnston. It's a fantastic, very readable book. And we created this company called Improbable, and we made our first show, which was a storytelling show that I performed in. It's where we first used newspaper and sticky tape to storytell, and it ended up at PS 125 in New York. And we performed it there, and we won an Obie actually. So that was,
for people listening around the world, is off Broadway. It's the Oscar, the Tony, the Olivier for off Broadway.
Off Broadway, yeah. So that actually was it's probably why I ended up at the Met, because it was our route into stuff happening in New York. And we had also, just as we were forming that company, made this show called Shock-Headed Peter, which was a musical show with lots of puppetry in it, which also went off Broadway. So there was a kind of group of people who were working in the same way through improvisation, devising, and creating the kind of theatre that we wanted to see. And we have been going since then. I think it will be next year, I think, is our 30th anniversary as Improbable. But I've been working with Lee Simpson since 1985. We're still working together. So, you know, we still got some stories to tell. But throughout that period of working together, there has been a sensibility of improvisation being an essential part of how you keep things alive. So sometimes you might totally improvise a show and make one up every night, even if it's got big sets. You could still be different every night. But if you've got a text that's the same every night, how do you make sure that text stays alive? If you've got an opera score, which, as you say, has to be learned and really stay kind of like, absolutely, there's a conductor going there. How do you create an inner landscape and internal landscape that makes sure that you're finding different things every time you sing the same aria every night, because it is different every night. It's a different night. There's a different audience there, and if you go to the opera, it's useful for you as an audience member to remember that will be the first time that that singer will be singing with you there, and all the combination of people. It's a unique moment.
Yeah.
But because those shows happen again and again, there is a brain thing that persuades you, oh, I've done this show before. You haven't done the show before. That's the beauty of opera, the live experience. It's a unique moment every time. And so really, all improvisation means is remembering that. So improvisation in terms of, there's some very fine conductors and musical directors who understand that the job of an orchestra is to have the skill to be able to reproduce the score, but the real deeper skill is to make sure it happens in the moment every night and responds to what the world is like in that moment. And I think if you create a great, opera production, it will be responding to what's happening in the world. Even if it's an old traditional production, the audience will bring those questions about what's happening in the world into that space. And that place is an opportunity for us as a collective to recognize we're all trying to answer some questions about what the world could be, how it could be better. And opera is one of those places that can happen.
And you are anticipating what is not my next question, but the one after that, which are those questions. But what I'm about to say, I hope does not give offense to people listening, because it's not intended to. But in Italy, historically, there was poverty, as there was much of the world, and still is, unfortunately, much of the world. And the Neapolitans used an expression, l'arte di arrangiarsi. In other words, the art of making things happen each day. In other words, you have to improvise when you wake up in the morning, because will Mount Vesuvius be blowing?
Exactly.
Will there be a storm?
Yeah.
Will there not be food? Will there be an invasion? Will there be cholera? All the things that have befallen this gorgeous but troubled city that is Naples. And I, in New York City, and when I travel, see people who are homeless, people with mental illness, people who just are hungry. All of that, the way they conduct their lives is improvisation. And it's a different kind of improvisation from what you and I were talking about in the theater. But nonetheless, it requires the focus, the resilience, the ability when the need to adapt presents itself, that if you need water or shelter, you do that safely. And there are people who do this for decades.
Yeah. Some
few by choice, that they prefer to be out in the world that way. But most because they
don't choose that
of circumstance. And when I walk around, I try, I was talking about this the other day with someone. There's a man who used to be a musician, who was a performer, and he had a death in his family that really shook him. And now he basically lives on a bench, and he doesn't talk about music anymore. And I occasionally try to go visit him, and on some days he doesn't want to talk to anyone. On other days he talk to me. And I realized something you know very well, how it all can change in a moment, and how precious life is, how vulnerable we are, and how something in his life happened that just tipped him over. And music making is no longer his expression. Survival and the conflicted feelings he has about the person who died are what guide him now. He, in his own way, improvises. I discuss that with him. But improvisation is such an important word, because it can create wonderful, beautiful things in theater, in science, and cooking, and wherever you go. But it also sometimes is a question of survival.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that sounds like it's a touching story. What I in these moments now when we feel the world's maybe in these big crises, it's dealing with challenges like we haven't met before, and one finds oneself going, what am I should be doing something about this. Why am I doing this thing? Is it just entertainment that's an escapist thing? But actually I find myself, deluded or not, I find myself saying, actually, it is even more important at these moments to create art, to create things which connect people to spirit. And I don't know what that guy's situation is, but people are in extreme circumstances and they need food, but they also need something that looks after their spirit.
Yeah.
And we know this from extreme stories, these extraordinary stories around things like the Holocaust. People were surviving, but actually, very often, art is one of the things that keeps people's spirit going in those extreme circumstances. So I feel like the arts do have an important job. It shocks me that both the arts seem to be talked about as unimportant at the moment, but then weirdly being attacked, which on some level must mean, well, actually, maybe they are important, or well, you wouldn't be attacking them. So I feel like it's important for those of us who do find ourselves in this part of the world, looking after art. We're doing an important job, I think, and I actually think the world would be in less trouble if people behaved in other areas more like they were creating art, because then that opens up these other levels of humanity. We just made this show, My Neighbor Totoro, and it's a very beautiful adaptation of a Studio Ghibli film. And it's a very simple story about some little girls whose mother is ill in hospital. And it's about, they go to the countryside because she's in hospital and she's being looked after. It's a show about kindness and about care. And they meet this forest spirit who's kind of wild and extraordinary, and only the children can see this character. But we said, as we make this piece, we should make an intention to make it with care and kindness, because that's what the world needs at the moment. And we made this intention, and the way that we would check in every day, and we would make sure that people were able to share where they were at with the challenges that they were going through in the world. We didn't say you've got to leave all that behind. We included all that in the process, and consequently there is an atmosphere about that show which is actually quite joyous, because it's been made with care and kindness. And sometimes those processes on big shows aren't there. So I feel more and more as I get older, that's where my fight is. My fight is to fight for kinder spaces. And it doesn't mean you don't accept challenges and you don't try and be courageous and ambitious. But one of my ambitious things is to say, yeah, let's make these things that really are kind of beautiful, and like the hours itself, let's do these things that are big, but let's try and make them with a sensibility that's different, and show the world that you can make good work through that, through love and kindness. And it's strange. It's a strangely radical idea.
I hear you completely. I'll use the word friends. I think she would say the same with the writer Jan Morris, she was transgender. She had been
Yeah,
James Morris, and I met his writings as James and was deeply
yeah,
influenced
about
by
Venice.
his writings
Yeah,
when I was a very little boy.
yeah,
And later came to know her after her transition. I'm using terminology from 1971.
yeah.
And she wrote a book called Conundrum about what this transition meant to her.
Mm,
And um, I always found it very interesting that James Morris was a very strong, tall, ruddy
mm,
Welshman who climbed Mount Everest with Redmond Hillary and wrote about it and interacted with the world as a strong, handsome man.
mm,
Then again as a tall, ungainly, middle-aged, white-haired woman. And she experienced the world uniquely because of the treatment she received as a strong young man. And then as
oh,
an older woman,
mm,
she came to know women differently as a woman
yes.
than she did as a man, and came to know men differently as a woman than she did as a man.
Yeah.
And and later in her life, we corresponded and we would meet for meals in New York and in the UK. And I remember we had a very long wine saturated lunch here in New York on a hot day in July. And she said, she put down the glass and she said, you know, Fred, it's really quite simple. It's about kindness.
Mm,
She said that if we genuinely practice kindness, so many of these problems are not problems. And it always stuck in my head because she'd been someone who was very courageous, but also
yeah.
a trailblazer, a traveler in every
Mm,
sense. And she came to that conclusion, and that's what she practiced. Although many people looked at her, I hate the word, but as a freak, because
mm,
at that time in 1971, it was not the same. We still have issues of acceptance for people who are
yeah.
trans, but certainly then they were viewed as freaks.
Yeah.
And she fought it with kindness and continued to write
Mm,
magnificent books in journalism and lived an exemplary life. Now, um, on the Improbable website, improbable.co.uk, I want to see what you're up to next. And I found that you, Collective You, are doing workshops this summer, improvisation for an uncertain world.
mm,
And you say we live in extreme and overwhelming times, extreme
mm,
views, extreme weathers. It is all extremely worrying and easy to become polarized, stuck in one role or mood, divided from others, even divided within yourself. How do you hold it all without breaking?
mm,
And you pose some questions. How do you hold all the different things you have to do? How do you care for others without losing yourself? How do you manage the mundane and remain visionary? How do you hold the awfulness and the wonder of the world? And how do you feel hope amidst grief? These are the questions of now and not only now. You're doing this in workshops.
mm,
Was this
mm.
theater work? Tell me what's planned.
You know, it is. I mean, it is theatre work, but it's. I guess it's psychological work. It's what we would call world work. Um, I don't know if you know. Another of my teachers is a guy called Arnold Mindell,
No.
and Arnie Mindell is an amazing teacher. He was a quantum physicist who then uh, transitioned to becoming a Jungian therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And he developed a thing called dream body work, which was working with dreams and their reflection in body symptoms. And that work has opened out into lots of other areas. Um, some of it is like group forum work, which he calls world work, where you role play all the aspects of an issue. So you might work on something like, say, racism or global conflict, and you role play in the space those the presence of all the roles around those issues. You play them out, people fill them out in groups, and the process is one of awakening and awareness. So that's one aspect of it. So that's like the kind of thing that we would explore on that workshop. And we've used that both to explore that, but also if you were working on a play or something like Aida, you could explore all the different roles. You could explore what he calls the ghost roles. And the ghost roles are the roles that are mentioned but aren't present. So they might be something like the children or the dead. You know, we talked about these soldiers coming back. They would be a ghost role, and you could fill that role out around. So it's about exploring all the dynamics that are held in the great, enormous, as John Kabat-Zinn calls it, the full catastrophe, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you hold the paradox of all that? So that work of Arnie Mindel's is work that we've taken into how we work with exploring character, how we work exploring creativity. And our workshops, we would use that kind of work. And I mention this because I think we shared something about our own lives off camera, Fred, about care and looking after people. One of the first shows our company made was a show called Coma. And Arnie Mindell did a lot of work with people in coma states and what he calls near-death states. And the altered states, the extreme states that people go through near death. Mm-hmm. And we made a show about that and about that work, which has had a big influence on me in my life and on the way that we work. And a lot of that work is about the kind of states which are kind of what he would call dreamland states. And as we get older, as we know people who in consensus reality change their identity, things like memory loss, there are ways of being with those people that Arnie, I first learned about through this coma work. And it's about going to where people are. And, you know, that's like a practice of how do you stay present with someone as they change as a person. And these near-death states that we will all go through in some form or other, if we're lucky enough to go through a slower death process.
Yeah.
And the more we get to know them before that happens to us, the less frightening those processes will be for ourselves, because there are aspects of ourselves that we're living people and we're healthy but then these other states come in and we meet them through our dreams, we meet them through our body symptoms as we get older and as we get illnesses and so on. And these states are marginalized because the world says normal people are healthy and blah, but actually normal people aren't like that. They go through all these changes, all these processes. So as Jan Morris said, actually, it's very, very sophisticated, but it's also very simple. You're talking about kindness. And one is talking about being kind to those aspects of life, those aspects of ourselves and other people. And as we go into processes of getting older, eldership, one of the aspects of eldership is looking after, holding space for other people. One of the aspects is what we were talking about, care. Now, that little bit of text on the workshop is actually written by Matilda, my wife, who's another member of the company. She's an associate director, and she has a group called Mothers Who Make, or Mother/Others Who Make. because it's now widened into a group that say, is it possible caring? So that caring might be looking after children, it might be looking after someone who's sick, it might be looking after someone who's older. Let's not set those things up against each other. Can we bring caring into our work more? Can we even bring our work into the spaces where we're caring? And can we make those realms more fluid so that we hold them together? And a kinder world would be where our workplaces are where we care for people, and spaces that are about caring aren't just marginalized from the everyday world. Mm-hmm. So if you are a carer, often you become isolated. So Matilda's group, which started out because she was looking after her story of writing her novel on her bedroom floor, on the children's bedroom floor at night, looking after our autistic children, she realized that she had these two aspects and they were often set against each other. But in what Arno Mindell calls a deep democracy, those aspects of life would be welcomed in and not treated as something which everyday life has to push out of the way. So when you talked a little bit about your own story of caring, that resonated with me because Matilda in the last year was also very ill. So I became a carer for her as she was going through her process with leukemia. Mm-hmm. And I had to address this thing of how do I look after my work life, because we need to still eat, whatever, look after our children, but also how do I look after her and look after myself so that I can look after her? So for me, that's what kindness is. It's pretty hardcore.
There is a group in New York, I wouldn't call it a group, I would call it a program by Columbia University and also by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other arts institutions here, but primarily not theater so much and not opera, but more music, perhaps dance, and certainly visual arts, in which people who are caregivers, are the participants rather than the people receiving care. There's that too.
Yeah.
Where I know the one at the Met Museum best, where you gather as a group once a month and you don't bring in the cares of the world. You arrive to step away from the cares of the world, and there's sort of a warm-up where you just simply relax and breathe together, and then you go look at one work of art. And you don't wander through the museum. You talk about that one work of art without judgment of one another, and how if there are 10 people together, they will perhaps notice certain things in common, but see very different things in the same painting or sculpture because of what they bring to it.
Yes.
So the act of doing that, they're teaching one another about perception, but they're also, frankly, stepping away from all their own cares.
Well, in order to care, as I said earlier, one needs to take care of oneself. That means making sure your own well doesn't run dry.
Yeah.
So art, absolutely, I feel, is one of the things that can feed the well, fill the well, so that then you can share that with other people. So I think that's a very, really beautiful example of how part of care is making sure you look up, but also the act of gathering. And one of our projects is about gathering. And I think you go and see a show, it's actually an act of gathering, but also gathering to connect and gathering around art, which becomes a conduit for having maybe conversations that one wouldn't normally have is something that looks after people's spirit and ultimately looks after, hopefully, the world a bit more at times when it needs it.
There's a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that people, I'm sure, can find online by Vincent van Gogh called First Steps.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of this group's recent meetings, that was the painting they looked at.
Mm-hmm.
And ostensibly, what it is an agricultural pastoral setting in which a little child, probably a girl, but we're not sure, and the woman caring for her, probably her mother, is suddenly the child feels capable of making her first steps, walking toward a man who has put down his farming equipment to receive the child as she walks. And that's the story of the painting. The act of looking at it, there are the colors, there's structure, there's perspective, and so on. And different people saw very different things. The thing that I noticed was that the gate was shut to where they were. And no one else noticed that or seemed to care about it. And that, to me, was a fundamental thing because it represented safety. And that the child would not run away.
Yes.
And, it said what it said about my view of things and safety and security and so on. But other people saw happiness. Other people saw the laundry hanging, all the nappies that had to be washed in 1890 in France because there was no laundry service. And people saw different things based on their experience. And the collective experience of talking about a painting that basically was a baby taking her first steps was fascinating. And by the end of the conversation, no one had to say, gee, that was fascinating. We all knew it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was that. And it's a very simple process. It takes 90 minutes, basically, once a month. And people could do this more often on their own. But the group together and conversing about what they experienced is what made it so interesting, because they're not necessarily art historians.
No.
They could be, but that's not what you're supposed to bring to that experience.
I know that, but that also, and correct me about this, but I feel like that's what, the little invitation you made to me, to that delicious meal, to talk, the collective gathering around food, because that's also how people share. You're being sustained, but you're also being sustained by the conversation. And there's a lovely David White talks about conversation and the conversational nature of reality, which is that what you expect of reality will never be quite what reality expects of you. And in between those two things, there's a change that happens. A conversation is an important thing. And it seems like that's what you love, Fred, because you love
with the right
people
and with people like you.
yeah.
I mean, I will now ponder, and I invite people to go to the Improbable website. It's improbable.co.uk, and read anything they want about your activities, your group activities, but specifically your summer workshops, because I read aloud before Improvisation for an Uncertain World. Yes, they all certainly strike chords. How do you care for others without losing yourself? The one of the five that hit me the most was, how do you manage the mundane and remain visionary? All these questions are important. For many people, how do you feel hope amidst the grief? That could be the big one for most people nowadays.
Yeah.
Holding on to vision, to me, it gives me hope. That's what that is.
Yes. I think what's hard about the uncertain world that we live in, and it is the nature of reality.
Yeah.
It's uncertain. And I know my own childhood growing up, lots of the challenges my parents had were that they wanted to make the world more certain. They wanted to make sure we got a proper education so that we got a proper job. and then they could just relax because they'd sorted everything out for us. But actually, that the journey of life is coming to terms with the fact that there is nothing certain. And how does one hold the fact? The fact of the matter is that everything is uncertain.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we're born means that we are going to experience, you know, our death. The
Yeah.
fact that we fall in love means that we will experience grief. Those two things exist as part of the existence of life, you know, and that's why I think probably I've always loved improvisation, because it's about a practice which goes, say yes to not knowing what's going to happen, acknowledge you don't know what's going to happen next, and how do you say yes about that, and how do you stay happy and laughing knowing that you're going to fail. Because then once you have accepted that that's the practice and that you'll never get really good at it or it wouldn't really be a practice, how does one live one's life like that? So that's why improvisation for an uncertain world, in a way, improvisation is the best muscle that you can learn, because you will lose your job, you will lose that person that you love, you will lose, you know, the money that you invested in that, and you will have to deal with that.
Yeah.
There are no certainties.
I have loved our conversation, Phelim, and we sort of created a time frame, and I'm going to stick to it of about 7 minutes more.
Oh yeah.
One of the other things that you're doing that I'm fascinated by, and we tipped it this
Yeah.
week, was the Eldership Project. We know them, I'm reading from you, we know them in stories, the toothless old cowboy
Yeah.
who grown with her potions, the grandfather who could relate to the tearaway teenagers and former ballerinas who know the price that must be paid. Elders in their stories, elders in stories know that their days of finding the cure, treasure, true love are over, but they help the hero or heroine bring by being wise and older and just being there.
Mm.
Um, I well, I'll just say this very briefly. My
Mm.
father died much too young, and he had so much that he didn't do. He was a wonderful man, a very talented musician, very kind. And when I realized that he didn't have much time because he had a bad disease, I
Mm.
had to decide what could we do to make the rest of his life meaningful.
Mm.
And I approached that. I was 40 at the time.
Mm.
And I want to say it changed me because I somehow was prepared to do it.
Mm.
And once he understood that every day that he was alive,
Mm.
we could not control when the death would come, but we could control what we did each day. It was so rich.
Mm.
He didn't have the privilege of becoming an elder,
Mm.
but he nonetheless, in those few months, imparted all of that to me that he would have perhaps done over time if he felt he had the luxury of time.
Mm.
And there are so many people who are quite old who are sort of shunted to the side. And in American English, maybe in British English too, there's a term now that's pejorative, which is elder speak. And elder
Uh-huh.
speak is when you talk to someone in a babying way. Have
Okay.
we had our lunch? Are we tired?
Mm.
Um, in other words, speak to them as adults,
Yeah.
but understand that they may not be able to respond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Treat them as an adult. And this act of doing that elicits from them the most genuine emotions, I find,
Mm.
by speaking to them in an adult way, because they're responding in an adult way. They just
Mm.
have to be years old.
Mm.
So tell me about the Eldership Project, please.
You know, the eldership project, it's got uh, many routes to it. Initially, we have our big open space events, and what they are is like a big 2-day, 2.5-day forum where people gather together and they self-organize to work on issues that are important. Now, I could talk about that a lot, but what I noticed in those events were there were spontaneous, like, elder and younger people hooking up in a way that I often didn't see happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember there was a wonderful a drag artist called Betty Bourne, who's recently died, sadly, and she was part of a company called Blue Lips, and there was a younger guy called Michael, and he wanted to become a drag artist, and Betty came alive meeting this young, telling stories about, Stonewall and the activism that they played when they went out to New York and so on. And I saw that was happening in lots of different ways in the group, and they were being given a role in that dynamic. And very often, as you say, people do the elder speak thing. Oh, they're no longer at the front. They're no longer running a building. They're no longer, and they're put out. People say they're put out to grass.
Yeah, yeah.
So we saw that there was this role that was not quite being looked after. So the project was about saying, can both we step into eldership better as a company and as ourselves, but can we create spaces where elders were given what they have? And one of the privileges of eldership is that you don't have to be the leader anymore. You don't have to be the leader who's at the front, but you can hold space. So one of the roles of the elder is to hold space for other people to do things. So as a company, we now hold space for other young artists to gather up together and to work on stuff. But also, the other thing about eldership is you can tap into your younger trickster spirit and behave with irreverence, and say the irresponsible thing. Say the thing that you're not allowed to say when and actually that's a very important role in the system. And it's one that we're not quite looking after. Now, it's led to different things, but I'll talk about one other thing which you may find interesting. So
I'm happy to talk about everything, but I want to respect your time.
I'm okay. I want to tell this story because it feels an important one. Mm-hmm. I was living in a place called Twickenham, and I was walking along in the street, and I saw on a bench this actor, and it was a guy called Trevor Peacock. Now, you won't know Trevor Peacock, but he was, when I was a young boy in Manchester at the Royal Exchange Theatre, I saw him perform in Waiting for Godot with Max Wall, who was an old British music hall star. And Trevor Peacock was one of these actors who was in, like, Royal Shakespeare Company shows. He was like a kind of wonderful older actor. And it was like me meeting my childhood hero on a bench by a local cafe. And I said, Trevor. And he said, oh, how do I know you? I know you. And I said, no, you don't. No, I know you. How do I know you? I said, well, you've got a very good memory, because I sat on the front row bench seats at the Royal Exchange Theatre and saw your Estragon with Max Wall. And you're one of my heroes. And he said, I can't do that anymore. And I said, what do you mean? And he was talking about going on stage. And he said, I wouldn't get past to be. And he meant he wouldn't even remember to be or not to be,
Yeah.
And it was wonderful meeting him. And I was on my way into town to meet Lee, the other artistic director. And I said, I just met Trevor Peacock, who was one of my heroes, one of the most amazing, beautiful comic actors ever. And he no longer goes on stage because he can't remember the lines anymore. And I said, I know a number of actors who said, I can't remember. My memory's going. I can't remember. And they worry about that. And I said, we teach improvisation. There are no lines. Mm-hmm. So what about if we got together a group of older actors they're not actually improvisers. They're not improv people who do improv comedy, but they're older actors who don't go on stage anymore. And we teach them some really simple improv. And let's find out what happens. So we created a show that was called Lost Without Words. And we put together a group of wonderful older actors who, I mean, some of them were still performing on stage, but were definitely in their eldership years. And we did this improv show at the National Theatre. We did it at the what was then the Cottesloe. I think it's called the Dorfman now.
The small theater.
Yeah. And we did 3 weeks, I think, of improvised shows, and this is like an offshoot of the Eldership Project. And we did these improv shows with older actors, and what was interesting about them was that they were not fast thinking and quick-witted. But if you set a scenario up where you said you are two people, you've been together for whatever, so many years and whatever, let's see what happens. And they would start very slowly, and them just walking across the stage was amazing because they had amazing presence.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we would give them simple improv exercises. They would do these scenes and they were like the best Mike Lee play you've ever seen. So we became aware that there was a whole wealth of performer that is on a certain level lost to the theatre going public. We found a little way for a few weeks to put that. And we have a secret dream that we will revisit that. We had a dream of going to different places and putting together, coming to New York, getting some older actors who don't go on stage anymore and saying, well, let's just do Lost Without Words. But it would be definitely people who were first time improvisers. So that's one of the little offshoots, and that's us following our noses, and that's improvising again. It's you follow your nose as to where something might go.
I always say if I wake up in the morning, I have a lot I have to do. And I said to you at the beginning of our conversation how moved I have been by the works of yours that I've seen more than once often. We didn't even talk about some of them, like The Hours, and a few more that I would love to have spoken about. But even The Addams Family, which people would think of as more mainstream, very moving to me. Those were not stories I followed as a kid. But I'm even more moved now after this conversation because you're very inspiring, and what I find nourishes me in my life. We all have challenges. Is when I feel inspired. Inspired is about breathing in. It's about air. That's where the word comes from. And I can breathe again. And I really sincerely thank you, Phelim McDermott, for this conversation.
I love that, as you say, inspired. But there's also another word I love, which is conspiracy. So
breathe together?
It's to breathe together. And in its good sense, I think there's a conspiracy of people who care about the right things. So it's nice to talk to you, Fred, because I we haven't met that often, but I know that we're in a secret conspiracy together to look after some of the good things in the world. So it's very nice to talk to you. And if the clock comes round and you want to pick the conversation up where we left off, please feel free to do so. My young son, this is Ridley.
Hello, Ridley.
Hello.
This is Fred, who's just interviewed me, and we've got to the end of our conversation. And Ridley's part of our conspiracy too. He's a young political activist who wants to change the world for the better. And this is Fred, who's one of the champions of the arts and opera.
How are you?
I'm in New York right now.
Uh,
Do you know where Ridley was born?
No.
in New York.
Very good. That can make you an American citizen, I hope, if you
well,
want.
Yeah.
I am an American citizen.
Very good.
Maybe I won't be. Trump's trying to take away birthright citizenship.
But we're going to fight for that, aren't we, Ridley?
Yes,
Yes.
we are.
I mean, the courts are going to strike it down.
Yes.
Let's hope so. Ridley could be the president. You never know.
I'll
vote for
try and
you.
change Britain for the better.
You have to turn 35 here, but once you turn 35, I'll vote for you.
Yeah. Okay, Fred.
Thank you, Phelim.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah. Take care now. Bye.
Bye-bye.